2 o'clock and people are starting to drop in. You're warmly welcome. We will wait a few seconds before we start. We have 200 that have signed up for this webinar today. So I think we can go to the next slide. And then I can share some house rules before we start. I think most of you are familiar with this webinar setting. But we wait. Thank you. So my name is Maria Öhlund, and I'm the project manager of the Focali Research Network, one of the organizers today. So I think we will start now. I warmly welcome all that have joined the meeting. And before handing over to the moderator, I will give a few house rules and also present the organizers and the team behind this event today. So welcome. This is a post-match analysis after COP16 to dig into the outcomes and implications of that. And you will be able to ask questions. It is a bit tight of time, but you can post your questions in the Q&A function, not in the chat, because then we will not see them. And you can also vote up questions from others that you like. And we warmly welcome you to still interact with people in the chat. And to get the chat going and start that up, you can introduce yourself in the chat if you want, who you are and where you are calling from. We know that we have 200 people signed up from different parts of the world, so it would be great to see a few of you there in the chat. And this is a dialogue to understand each other's perspectives and experiences better. So please, both in the panels and in the chat, use a respectful tone towards the other participants. Thank you. And then I will introduce the organizers on the next slide. So this is a collaboration between the Forest Climate Livelihood Research Network Focali that I'm managing, and Jessica and Stephen and also Alex in the program are members of. And we collaborate closely with the SIANI, the Swedish International Agriculture Network Initiative, in this, hosted at Stockholm Environment Institute. And in the team, we have Maria Sköld, representing both SEI and SIANI, and also Maya at the SEI. We have Stephen also working with WWT Wetlands Center, one of the co-organizers. And we have Sarah Håkansson in Lund at the Center for Environment and Climate Science, CS, and also Therese Ek at Beck, also in Lund University, but it's a collaboration between University of Gothenburg and Lund University on biodiversity and ecosystem services in a changing climate. And also Alex and Jessica in the program belong to Beck. So it's a lot of synergies in this family of organizers. And it's also part of a series that relates to the Global Biodiversity Framework that we have arranged. And we did a similar post-match analysis after COP15. And organizers can also share more information in the chat on upcoming events and past events. And please do reach out to us if you have any questions or want to collaborate ahead. So we can go to the next slide. So let me introduce our great moderator of the day, Stephen Warnecki, belonging both to the Focali network and being a principal scientific officer at WWT, and also, among other things, a part of the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Maria. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It's a privilege to be the moderator for today's event, and I'm very, very grateful for all of your interest in joining, and also to our fantastic speakers and panelists. We're really excited to engage in this discussion with you. So welcome to this panel discussion. We aim to unpack what happened at the Convention on Biological Diversity's 16th Conference of the Parties, COP16, or the shorthand, the UN Biodiversity Conference, which had the tagline, "Making Peace with Nature." So this webinar is an attempt to digest what happened in Cali and get to grips with key developments and what they mean for coordinated action to address biodiversity loss. We are very privileged to welcome a fantastic set of panelists who have an immense depth and range of expertise and can take us deep into the heart of the negotiations and the conference, given their various key roles and positions. So to the next slide, please. So this is what we have lined up for you today. First of all, we will have the scene set for us on the COP, what was at stake and why it was important. Then we will invite the first set of panelists to join us, and they will set out some of the key negotiation outcomes, how they arose in the negotiations, and also their significance for meeting the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and more broadly for people and nature. There'll be time after that for 1 or 2 questions for the audience, and then we'll move to the second panel. The idea with this panel is to give a deeper sense of the emerging themes and conversations that happened in Cali over and above the negotiations themselves. So to give you a flavour of the event, but also to help understand the implications of what happened in Cali for actions on the ground and for implementation. After that, there'll be a little bit more time for questions from the audience. And then finally, we will invite all the panelists back to give some final reflections and takeaways, and perhaps even respond to the remarks from the other panelists. So thank you again and welcome. So we're going to move now to the first part of the webinar. So that is the setting the stage, and therefore I have the pleasure to introduce Alexandre Antonelli, who is Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew and Professor at the Department of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Gothenburg, part of also Beck and part of Focali. So Alex, we would be grateful if you could help us to understand what was at stake at the conference. What was the CBD COP16 and why was it important? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Thanks so much, Maria, for all the organization for this event and so many people who could join today. It's really fantastic to see everyone here online in this virtual world. It was a fantastic event, I think, being part of COP16, which is the big meeting where nearly all countries come together to discuss biodiversity, which is really our life supporting system on this planet. It's what makes life here possible. And of course, there's a huge amount at stake in terms of making peace with nature. Next slide, please. So I'm also fortunate to be a trustee for WWF Sweden, and WWF has been publishing with ZSL and some partners reports summarizing our understanding about what's happening with biodiversity worldwide. And of course, this situation is extremely dire. So in this year's report, there was a 73% decrease in the measured population levels of all animals that have been tracked since 1970. So over this relatively short period, just 50 years, we've seen this major decline in those populations, which is, of course, the first step towards extinction. So that's extremely concerning. There's some variation across different regions. So, for instance, where I come from in Latin America, about 95% decrease. But the situation is really, really bad. And in next slide, I can also summarize what we've been producing in terms of knowledge for plants and Royal Botanic Gardens Kew and partners. So, for instance, last year we launched a report called The State of the World's Plants and Fungi 2023, where we brought together about 200 scientists from more than 100 institutions in 30 countries to summarize our understanding about both risks and opportunities for plant diversity. And here we're seeing a very similar situation for plants. Of course, it's a much larger number of species than, for instance, mammals or birds, but it's, of course, all part of the same environment. And here we're seeing 45% of all the plant species that are known, or the flowering plants, are at risk of extinction. And worldwide, we have estimates from IPBES, for instance, which are extremely concerning because about 1 million species are now estimated to be at threat of going extinct, which is, of course, something that should concern not only biologists, but, of course, all of us, because we're all affected by the benefits that biodiversity brings to us in terms of food supplies, medicine, building material, and so many other benefits. Next slide. So because of the urgency of the situation and the fact that we are really at a turning point, we believe, because this is probably the last chance we really have to turn things around. About 196 countries came together 2 years ago in Montreal. I was also fortunate to be there with some colleagues from Q, and it was a very decisive moment because the parties agreed on this very ambitious set of targets and goals. If you click on the slide, please, you'll see which is, of course, the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that's really what we need to do to turn things around. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework replaces the previous framework that went from 2010 to 2020. And despite the fact that it's extremely ambitious and it's really the right thing to do in terms of all the scientific evidence for stopping and bending the curve on biodiversity loss, we also know that so far, not a single target of the previous frameworks has been achieved in terms of biodiversity goals. Next slide. So the scientific evidence is very clear. What we need to do is really to change things considerably in the way that we are living our lives and using natural resources. And if we continue in the current trajectory, that's the business as usual scenario, which means will be a very difficult planet to live on. So basically, it's absolutely not sustainable. So to level it out, we need to increase conservation efforts in terms of both protection and restoration of ecological environments, of course, tackling climate change, invasive species, pollution, and some other threats. But really to start turning things around, so bending the curve, we also need to work with consumption. So both products and services to make them much more sustainable, but also to reduce overall consumption. And those are the things that we need to do. And that's why this framework is really targeting very specific areas of future development. Next slide. So the COP16, I mean, all the COPs are basically meetings, large meetings where all the countries that have signed to the Convention on Biological Diversity from 1992 come together. So notoriously only the US is the only major country that's not a co-signatory, but all the others are. And we're going to hear a bit more about how things went. But the objectives of this, if you click on the next, is basically the first one here to review the progress towards the Global Biodiversity Framework targets. So that's really about understanding how things are going. The second one is about a mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information. So it's not all about the physical specimens, it's about the DNA sequences, which allow us, for instance, to explore interesting properties for medicinal use, for food supplies, and so forth. And the third one that I'd like to highlight here is the biodiversity monitoring framework. As I said, we did not manage to really succeed in any of the previous targets, so we have to make sure we know we're on track and we're delivering on those very ambitious commitments. Of course, there were some other aspects as well, but in my mind, I think those were the three key aspects. The last two ones on this list were actually things that could have been decided already in the previous one 2 years ago, but were not, so postponed. And we're going to hear a bit more about how those were tackled in a few moments. I think my last slide is just to show you that besides all those governmental official negotiations, as Stephen was saying, there were many different things happening at the same time at COP. It's a very busy event. So for instance, organizations, they take the opportunity to release reports and to lobby and to present results from their work. UNEP presented a Protected Planet report to show progress towards the targets of area protection. I've been involved a lot with many colleagues around the world on developing a framework for biodiversity credits as an alternative funding mechanism for conservation. So we had a report and we had a paper in Nature as well. We're also part of a fungal pledge to recognize fungi, and the second largest group of organisms on this planet, but heavily neglected, and to have them into legislative texts and many other events, such as one that I'm showing here. So really understanding, for instance, how scientists can really contribute to achieve those targets. And for my last slide, I just want to also bring everyone's attention to the fact that COP16 is the biodiversity COP. There are 3 different series of COPs. 16, of course, is the number, 16th meeting of the Biodiversity Summit. But at the moment, we're also having the one in Baku, so that's the climate one. And the third series of COPs are the desertification COPs. And I think we have to realize that those COPs really need to speak to one another in terms of complementarity. And what the UNEP, or United Nations Environmental Programme, calls the triple planetary crisis. So how can the science and evidence really help turn things around for both biodiversity and climate, and of course not forgetting pollution? And desertification is part of this whole picture here as well. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what others are going to say in terms of the progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. We really appreciate you setting the stage for us like this. So now we're going to move on to our first panel. The panel will give a brief overview of the main outcomes and their significance, and then aiming to dive into why these results occurred. And part of our intentions here is to really dig into the negotiation process, because we've got a range of people here who were really key to the negotiations. So it's my great privilege to introduce the panel. So we have Charlotta Sörqvist, the CBD Chief Negotiator for the Swedish delegation and Chair of Working Group 1, and Senior Advisor at the Division of Natural Environment, Ministry of Climate and Enterprise at the Government Offices of Sweden. We will also welcome back Alex to the panel as well. We also have Pernilla Malmer, expert in the Swedish delegation to COP16 and co-lead in the negotiations on Article 8J on traditional knowledge and the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We also have Jennifer Tauli-Capuz, Cancuna e Igoro, Indigenous people in the Philippines, lawyer and managing director for policy at Neotero and negotiator of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, or IAFB. And then last but not least, Clarice Kaler-Siebert, Senior Advisor at the International Unit at the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, and at the COP, the co-chair for negotiations on biodiversity and climate change synergies. So thank you very, very much for joining us, and a warm welcome to you all. So I'm going to ask each of you to present in turn some brief highlights from the negotiations and help us to understand why they occurred, as well as their significance. So we will turn first to Charlotta Sörqvist. So Charlotta, given your experience as Chief Negotiator of the Swedish delegation and Chair of Working Group 1 at COP16, we'd be very grateful if you could provide a brief overall introduction to the negotiation outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks a lot, Stephen, and thank you, Maria, for organizing this event, and hello, everybody. Very happy to be invited again to this discussion. I think it's very important to, as many others, I just arrived home from Colombia, and it's very good to have the opportunity to discuss the outcomes and have time to debrief and try to make analysis, because when you go through everything what happened, we have a lot of decision was taken, but we also have some lessons learned and some things we need to do in front of us. So COP16 was the first COP since the historic adoption of the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We do have a target. We know what we want to do, but as it's very understandable, this COP was very much mentioned as an implementation COP, very much focused on what has been done. Many parties have the information about their updated NBSAP or national target that has been presented. But also we need to negotiate many outstanding issues for COP15 that would help parties to fulfill their targets. And I'm very happy that many decisions was taken. For instance, we do have a decision on essential element of multilateral mechanism and benefit sharing use of DSI. I think we'll hear more about that. It was a historic thing that could be taken on, and I think it's very important because very much linked also to the third objective of convention. Marine issues have historically been very difficult to conclude at COP. But at this COP, we have decisions both of our work on the EPSAs and conservation and sustainable use of marine and coastal biodiversity. And regarding Article 8J on indigenous peoples and local communities, we're very happy about the decisions on the new program of work and the decision on establishment of a permanent body. And there are others as well. I mean, we will hear more about biodiversity and climate change. We have other decisions on biodiversity health, on invasive alien species, and many others. And those decisions will be very important for our implementation. But I think many of you have heard what happened in the end. Time was short. In absence of a quorum at the plenary, COP16 was adjourned before important agenda items are finalized. And well, of course, that's not very good. I mean, we have the same situation at COP15. We have to adjourn without to officially close the COP. But at this time, we do have substantive issues that have not been finalized. We need a decision on a monitoring framework in time for our national reports. Our national reports are to be submitted in February 2026, and I think that the decision on monitoring framework could have been concluded if we have time to do it. Regarding the seasonal planning, monitoring, reporting, and review, we have discussed we want to have a global stock take to be sure where we are in the fulfillment of the global targets. I'm very sorry we didn't have time to finalize that. And it was very, very difficult to find a common landing zone regarding the issue of resource mobilization. It is very difficult to make an analysis why it happened like that. We have had 9 sessions in contact groups. We didn't have much time in the end, and well, it was impossible to conclude it at 4 o'clock in the morning when we didn't have quorum. So that's what's happened. So just to conclude, I think that I both feel very proud and happy about all the decisions that were taken, many historic ones. On the other hand, I'm very sorry we couldn't conclude the meeting. We still have issues that needs to be discussed, and I'm especially worried about the planning, monitoring, reporting, and review. But it's very much linked to the whole idea of stock take and reporting, and that's something that was quite important part of the package from COP15. But of course, we also need to have a decision on resource mobilization. We had a draft update the resource mobilization strategy. I think that also could be quite easily finalized if you had some more time, but it was difficult regarding the issue between if or when a new global fund. That, of course, a very tricky issue to discuss. So that was happened. But in short, both happy, but also a bit disappointed. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotta. We really appreciate your kind of honest appraisal and also your feelings around what happened. I think that sets us up to dig now a little bit deeper into some of these more specific negotiation outcomes. So I'm going to turn back to Alex first. Alex, could you shed light on the digital sequence information outcomes that you set out in your presentation as one of the really important objectives for this COP?
Thank you. Yes, it was very important. And as Charlotte says, it is one of the main objectives of the COP16 meeting as well. So I think it was a major milestone. We've been discussing this topic since the 1990s. So I was very pleased to also see that there were no suggestions to restrict access for non-commercial use. So for instance, most scientists interested in fundamental questions like evolution and taxonomy or working with conservation efforts. So there wasn't anything like that. The agreement here was to create the first ever global fund to which companies using genetic data, so DNA sequences and related data, should contribute, and that's very important, the terminology here. They should contribute along together with these unique multilateral mechanisms. So all putting money into this common pot here. Of course, it would have been better if the language was a bit stronger, or if it was like a regulatory framework. But this is a first good achievement, I think. And those are pharmaceutical, cosmetics, agribusinesses, technology companies, really wanting to use genetic data to develop their products. And then the agreement is that they should contribute 1% of their profits or 0.1% of their revenue. So that's the Cali fund that they created under the agreement. I still haven't seen any big company announcing that they're going to do that. So it's still voluntary, but hopefully some will take the lead and others will follow. I should also say that I've seen a lot of signs of a bit of a paradigm shift in this field. So I've been involved with my colleagues at Q and others, helping, for instance, the Brazilian government and Brazil, Colombia, several other countries in the global south are very keen to move towards a bioeconomy system. So using biodiversity more sustainably. So instead of just protecting it, they want to make money out of biodiversity, basically. So I think this agreement will certainly support those ambitions in a way that's much more equitable than we've seen before in the past.
Thank you, Alex. I feel like for those of us who are not plugged into the COP16, that the DSI, the Digital Sequence Information negotiations, could have fallen a little bit under the radar. So we're grateful for you highlighting these outcomes as well. So for folks to understand what the potential significance and historical significance of these decisions were that were taken in Cali.
Yeah, so I think, when it comes to physical specimens, if you go to the rainforest in Borneo or another place, and there's a strong regulatory framework, what it can do, your access and benefit sharing. So if you take a biological sample, so the Nagoya Protocol regulates how that access benefit sharing should happen. But when it comes to digital information, that's virtual digital data out there currently in databases such as NCBI, where there are billions of DNA sequences, and any company can easily download this, lots of sequences from many different places, develop a product. And at this point, until now, there wasn't any mechanism for those companies to actually send funds back to the country's origin and the indigenous people and local communities who have been really the stewards of biodiversity. And now it's also, I believe 50% or so of those funds should go directly into their ownership and how they're going to use that for nature protection and the sustainable lifestyles that they have. So it's a very important achievement, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. We understand this is a really important extra channel of resources and funding for biodiversity conservation. Thank you so much. So I will turn now to Pernilla. And Pernilla, given your experience in the Swedish delegation to COP16 and as co-chair for the contact group on the agenda item on issues related to Indigenous peoples and local communities' participation, we would be really grateful if you could help us understand the significance of the decision on the new program for Indigenous peoples and local communities, the new permanent body in the CBD for representation and participation, and the importance of including traditional knowledge in the implementation of the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And well, the never-ending cheers in the plenary after the adoption of the decision on the new permanent body for Article 8J and Indigenous peoples and local communities as holders of traditional knowledge was indeed one of the highlights of the COP16. It was fantastic because we did not realize it would happen until really the end. And the permanent body, I think, is like groundbreaking in the sense that it so much is about recognition and strengthening Indigenous peoples and local communities' roles as holder of traditional knowledge on biodiversity, and for providing advice to the CBD and will provide a firm base for long-term strategy planning where there are equal part to others. And this decision did not really come from nowhere. The International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, IIFB, which is a broad network representing organizations actively engaged in biodiversity governance all over the world from Indigenous peoples and local communities, has been working for the establishment of the permanent body for at least the last decade. The earlier ad hoc working group on Article 8J has been delivering substantial contribution to the convention for over 20 years. The Global Biodiversity Framework adopted at COP15 refers to Indigenous peoples and local communities as key actors to revert biodiversity loss and for the implementation of the framework at all levels, which reinforce a strong relevance of a permanent body. A next logical step then, in recognizing them as valid, equal, and efficient partners to government in the implementation, was the permanent body. And this body will have the same status as the two other subsidiary bodies under the convention, the SUBSTA, which is the subsidiary body of scientific, technical, and technological advice, and the SPA, which is a subsidiary body on implementation. So in summary, the decision on the permanent body did not come from nowhere. The IIFB, with increasing support from insightful parties, have been paving the way by building strong structure. Another important factor here was that Colombia, as the host government, had the establishment of the permanent body as one of their highest priorities. And they were strongly backed by their own indigenous platform in Colombia, and not to forget the African descent population there. The new program of work then, which was also adopted, will be fully integrated and strengthen the framework further. Each of the 8 elements respond to goals and targets of the KMGBF, such as conservation, where a substantial part of the 30% of terrestrial and marine areas to be protected is on indigenous territories. An important new element is on human rights-based approach as one of the cross-cutting consideration for the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. Direct finance and support to IPLC in their conservation effort is another new component. A specific element is also dedicated to knowledge and culture. So throughout the COP16, we indeed went through many thrillers in this contact group and in the working group. It was never obvious that the permanent body was to be established before the final adoption in the plenary. It met high resistance from a limited numbers of, but very strong parties. But that story we have to take another time, as we have limited time now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pernilla. I think it's really interesting to understand the historical significance of this decision, and we congratulate all of you who were involved. And I'm also grateful that you shed light a little bit more on the details of the decision, that it's not just the establishment of the new body, but there's also various provisions that are worth paying attention to as well. And thank you also for shedding light on some of the dynamics of the negotiation, because I think from the outside it's quite difficult to get a sense of what actually goes into pushing some of these decisions forward. You mentioned the IIFB, Pernilla, and we have the pleasure now to introduce Jennifer, who was negotiator of the IIFB at the COP. And so, Jennifer, we would be grateful if you could build on what Pernilla was saying and also offer your perspectives on other negotiation tracks as well, if you like. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for having me at this webinar. The IIFB is the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and we are a forum that brings together all of the indigenous peoples and local communities that attend particular specific CBD meetings. The IIFB was officially recognized at COP5 as an advisory body to the Conference of the Parties on issues of indigenous peoples and local communities. Having said that, we call ourselves negotiators, but in reality, we are observers. And so we, of course, bring in our thoughts, our reflections, and our proposals, but it always has to be supported by a party. However, in these many years that we have been working within the working group on Article 8J, at the COP and at the subsidiary bodies, I think I'd like to believe that we have built up a reputation of being constructive and being problem solvers. And so we engaged in many COPs now. And at COP16, it was very important for us to identify our priorities, because we hear every time, for example, the EU has to coordinate 27 countries, but the IIFB has to coordinate indigenous peoples worldwide. So it's very, very diverse. There are 7 different social-cultural regions, many different priorities. And there were some regions that were really concerned about For instance, issues like conflation of indigenous peoples and local communities. So we had to work through all of these different perspectives and different priorities in order to identify what our priorities were for COP16. And through that long process, we identified the subsidiary body, of course, as a priority, the program of work, the monitoring framework, specifically including indigenous indicators within the monitoring framework, DSI, and direct access to finance through the resource mobilization decision, as well as the DSI decision. Cornelia has said that we did have victories on the program of work and on the subsidiary body, but I have to say that the subsidiary body was a partial victory. The COP president was very optimistic that this would be an early victory. In fact, I had planned many side events on the second week because they said that it would be adopted on the first week. But of course, there were some difficulties and there were some attempts to use the subsidiary body decision as a sort of trade for other issues in other streams of negotiations. So it's a partial victory because the first meeting will be talking about the modus operandi as the main agenda item, whereas we really wanted to dig into implementation of the program of work. However, it's still a victory. It's historic within the Rio Convention's multilateral environmental agreements. Of course, the program of work is a big victory. The monitoring framework, although it wasn't adopted, there was consensus that land tenure of indigenous peoples would be a headline indicator for Target 22, so that was a big victory. Digital DSI as well as resource mobilization also include the notion of increasing access of indigenous peoples to finance, including direct access. And so that is also a victory for indigenous peoples. Of course, there are many things that we need to follow up on, but I will leave that for the question and answer if someone's interested in hearing about the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We really appreciate your insights here. That was really interesting to hear. And also, I think it also reveals how valuable it is to get different perspectives on the negotiation outcomes, that we should look at them from different angles and we see different things. And thank you for reminding folks to post their questions in the question and answer window, please, because we'll have time in a few minutes to get at some of those issues like you mentioned going forward. I see some really interesting questions already emerging. Thank you for that. So now I'm going to turn to Clarice. And Clarice, we're really grateful that you could join us as well, especially since you acted as co-chair for the negotiations on biodiversity and climate change. So we'd be really grateful if you could shed some light on those negotiations, the process, as well as the outcomes. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. And thank you also to the organizers and to my fellow panelists for the interesting reflections so far. So as mentioned, I co-chaired together with a colleague from China, the contact group on biodiversity and climate change. And for those not familiar with the technicalities of the negotiations, the contact group is the lowest technical level of negotiations, and what can't be resolved there then goes up to a working group and ultimately to the plenary where decisions are actually gabbled through. Many saw from the Montreal negotiations, the Chinese minister with the gavel. That happens at a much higher up. And in the contact groups where both Pernilla and I were co-chairs, there are chunks of time allotted to the negotiations. And in our case, on the decision on biodiversity and climate change, we were initially allotted 2 contact groups, so about 6 hours of negotiating time. And in the end, they kept adding and adding because it was moving forward, but not quite fast enough. And we had 4 groups with a total of 15 hours of really intense negotiation. So in this case, it was worth it. So about the outcome, it's a decision of almost 6 pages, which is quite a long decision. And it reflects maybe partly the fact that at COP15 2 years ago, the COP failed to deliver a substantive outcome on this decision. And there's lots of reasons for why that might be, and we don't need to get into them here and now. But the first notable part of the outcome is that there was an outcome. The time was ripe. But because this had been brewing for maybe 6 years, it was well aged, and every party involved had something that they really wanted in because they'd been thinking about it for so long. Which meant that there was also a lot of tradable material. I'll let in what you want if you let in what I want. The result, the final document, and these final documents haven't been published yet because of the sort of outstanding status, the non-status of the resolution of the COP. The result is a balanced decision in which many past decisions are noted. It acknowledges the science of both the IPCC and of IPBES, so the Intergovernmental Panels for Synthesizing both Climate and Biodiversity Science. That sounds perhaps fairly basic. Of course, the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention have established scientific panels, and they will use the results of these panels to make good policy choices. But the panels themselves are political, and so there are always some who don't want to let in the science, if you want. But we've managed to welcome the results of both, which was a small, if obvious, victory. And the decision that we reach also mentions a number of sticky issues like nature-based solutions and geoengineering, which intimately link biodiversity and climate change challenges on the one hand and solutions on the other. And the decision also mandates some concrete actions to be taken in the coming 2 years. And I'll get to some of those later if we have time a bit more concretely. As to why there was a decision, I think that was part of the question. And I think it's always some happenstance. There's some national politics mixed with some geopolitics and some luck and some hard work, and you shake it all up, and sometimes you can achieve something and sometimes you can't. For the climate decision at COP16, there was some sense of now or never because it hadn't succeeded the time before. If we weren't able to deliver something now, it would have sort of begged the question about whether this was the right forum in which to discuss the issue of biodiversity and climate change. There's also the factor of the countries involved and what they have for positions. One factor is that Brazil now has a government that wanted a decision on climate change. In the past, they had the opposite decision, and Brazil is a very strong voice in this matter. Some parties maybe wanted less of a decision, but they weren't as active in our contact group, or maybe prioritized something else that was happening in parallel. So that's a little bit of the balance between luck and hard work. It was also priority for the Colombian presidency to have a decision on climate change, and that was maybe partly influenced by the political friendship that Colombia and Brazil have right now, as Brazil will host next year's climate COP30. And finally, I think the ground was partly laid at the preparatory meetings. So between the COPs every 2 years, there are subsidiary bodies that meet and prepare the ground for some of these decisions. Climate change and biodiversity was just discussed at Substa 25 over a year ago. And there wasn't time to reach a decision. So the document that came out was really a wish list where everybody threw in at the last minute some of what they wanted. And so the result was that everybody got to keep some of what they wished for. Maybe I stop there with initial reflections.
Thank you so much, Clarice. I really appreciate you going into the depths of the negotiations. When I was sitting in on the negotiation track that you were co-chairing, it was sometimes difficult to understand why certain countries were mobilizing in certain ways, or why they were framing, the science that you mentioned, the IPCC or IPBES in certain ways. So I'm grateful that you shed some light on that, because I think that kind of interpretation and unpacking is really useful for those of us kind of on the outside of the process. Thank you so much. So we have now time for the Q&A for the first panel. And I would like to spotlight the issue of NBSAPs. Bear with me a second. Oh, it's disappeared. But I think that this is something that was important to us, given that this was the implementation COP, that the national biodiversity strategies and action plans are like the main tool that countries have for meeting the global biodiversity framework at the national level. And there was this issue that so few countries had submitted their NBSAPs before the COP began. And I wonder if one of you from the panel would be interested to speak to this issue of this lack of NBSAP publication or updates that came before the COP. How do you think that kind of set the stage for the COP? Did that influence what happened, the decisions, the negotiations? Is there anyone that would like to come in on that? Charlotta, please.
Yes, thank you. Maybe that would be something I can comment on. Before the COP started, it was a meeting on sustainable body on implementation that were focused on implementation issues, and it was a dialogue about processes, challenges, and successes. And during that week, it was quite clear that the decision from COP15 is that the parties are supposed to, if possible, update the NBSAP or at least present national targets. And my feeling, at least, was that it was not a feeling of disappointment. It was more or less that a feeling of engagement, and the parties were happy to tell them that we are working on NBSAP or we have presented our national targets. And it was growing all the time. I think when the SBI started, it was, I think, 30 countries that presented NBSAP. And then in the end, I think it was 44. So it was growing all the time. And I mean, more than 100 parties have presented a national target. So I think you have to see in the perspective that even if not all yet have presented the updated NBSAP, work is ongoing. And there are several reasons why it will take some time for some countries. You can have different processes. Some need to have internal consultations, and you want to have a whole society approach. For Sweden, for instance, we have not yet presented update NBSAP. We have said it will be done next year. But we have presented national targets. So at least my feeling was that it was clear that work was ongoing. It was a very interesting dialogue. And my feeling is that everybody have a sense of urgency and really wanted to make sure that they are doing what they need to do in order to fulfill the targets. But that, well, it's maybe a personal feeling on it, but at least I think the discussion at SBI was quite interesting in that regard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this shows why it's so valuable to have individuals such as yourself kind of shed light on these issues, which can be quite subtle from the outside, but actually are quite significant when you look at the process and the mechanisms that go on behind the scenes. So thank you for giving us a different perspective on the NBSAP issue. So I think another kind of hot topic the audience might be interested to know about is the issue of biodiversity finance. And we heard after the GBF, the Montreal COP, that there was this figure of the 700 billion, I think, and how we were going to meet this biodiversity finance gap. And I know that this was one of the issues that maybe didn't reach as much progress, at least on the surface. So I wonder if one of you would like to give us a sense of where we stand on the biodiversity finance kind of side of things. And Alex, I know that you have to go quite soon, so I wonder if you would like to step in to answer that question before you have to go.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think the financial mechanisms to support implementation of the global biodiversity framework is one of the absolutely most critical challenge that we have, and we knew that this was going to be a big focus of this COP as well. And I think it's interesting to see that a lot of people think about alternative funding sources. Of course, the Cali fund that we were discussing about, so the use of digital sequence information and big companies putting money into this common pot is one mechanism. I also mentioned in my short presentation that we've been working on this framework for biodiversity credits, which will avoid, hopefully, some of the drawbacks and pitfalls that we've seen with carbon credit markets in a much more inclusive way, non-fungible system. I've seen some interesting, very perhaps smaller but really transformative ideas, such as some people, for instance, including a mountain as a co-author in a song, so that Spotify funds go directly into that, recognizing that not the rights, only the rights, but the intellectual property rights of nature. So there are many different ideas flourishing, and that's a positive thing because, as I said before, it's not all about the formal government agreements, but also what's happening underneath. And the fact that at COP14, there were about 300 companies present, at COP15 about 1,000. And this time, at least, we had dinner with the Colombian Minister for Environment, Susana Mohammed, and she said it were about 4,000. I haven't double-checked that number, between 3,000 and 4,000. But there's a substantial increase in the interest from corporates as well in what they can do, because I think it's much easier for them, of course, to think about their carbon emissions. But because biodiversity is much harder to measure, it's not fungible, so just by here, you cannot compensate in the rainforest. I mean, there are lots of complications there, but I think they're really, really keen to understand what they can do, and it can also move much faster, and they can show leadership in a way that, 196 countries together. We've heard this before in the discussion here as well. It does water down a bit when you try to get a consensus. So I think it's very positive to see those different mechanisms. But the problem is when it's voluntary. So we all know that regulatory framework, when you have to pay a tax or a levy, is really the only way where we can get this substantial amount of funds that are going to be needed. So the $700 billion per year is one of the figures that have been circulated, and that's probably close to the truth. And we are nowhere yet at that level. So there's much more that needs to be done.
Thank you so much. As we round off this first panel, I want to thank all of you for shedding light on these negotiation tracks and these topics. I think it is really valuable, as Charlotta, you said, to have this chance to debrief after the COP. And Alex, what you were saying there provides us with a really nice bridge to the next panel. But I think we need to say goodbye to you at this point, right? Because you have another commitment.
Yeah, I'll be a few more minutes here and then I have to leave. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your participation. We really appreciate it. And then the rest of the panelists from the first panel, we will be able to invite you back at the end for some final reflections. So please keep around. But now I'm going to turn to the next set of panelists. Alex started to mention issues about funding, and then he also touched on what was going on around the negotiations, so what the countries were negotiating. But you start to get a sense that there's so much more going on in the conference. And so that provides us with a really nice bridge to the next panel. So I have the pleasure to introduce Jessica Lopez, researcher at BEC, at the Center for Environmental and Climate Science at Lund University, Ashana Puri-Hertz, program officer and lead on climate change and ecosystems theme at Swedbio at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and also Wilimo Peter, who is project co-coordinator of Youth for Nature's Inuka project in Kenya. And so nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. And in this panel, we want to give folks a bit of a broader sense of what discussions were happening in Cali, give them a flavor of what it was like to be there, and also try to connect that with what this means for action going forward, especially going forward on the ground and for implementation. Peter, are you with us? Or we will try to fix that. Okay, we would be grateful if we could spotlight Peter as well, please. But anyway, Jessica, I will start with... fantastic, thank you. Jessica, if you don't mind kicking us off.
Yes, well, I was very inspired of all these different discussions, and I want to touch upon two different topics. So one was this relationship between how was it to be there in this blue zone and the green zone, and how the green zone, the so-called Cup of the People, had a highlight into participation of the debates and the activism that was seen. But the second part will be much more on the things related to biodiversity and finance and bioeconomy. So if I may start with the second one, which is a more lengthy one, following on Alex's comments, it's there are different topics, different key elements that have both risks and opportunities as seen as a participant. So the resource mobilization from all these different sets of discussions on innovative financing mechanisms and ways to align this private public sector financing as instruments to fulfill biodiversity goals. That was a lot, both in blue and green zone, different talks. Then there was a bunch of events about these nature-based solutions, where some of the actors, both from private sector and the public sector, were trying to attempt how biodiversity and climate crisis could be linked together and seen from this perspective. But that's a very, very complex issue. But just to resume how increasingly important this is to global challenges that we're experiencing now. Then the biodiversity inclusive investments. This is very key because this is a way to mainstream biodiversity, though the financial decision-making processes that are behind all economic sectors are very, very difficult. So this was sort of like an overview of fantastic. It sounds good, but yeah, how do we go there? And I would love to continue more a bit. So there was definitely a very, very huge attention to bioeconomies. So how to promote the sustainable use of biological resources, but though under a new building of new economic models. So business as usual wouldn't work for many purposes in majority of the cases, but how to deal or who is doing what. And in that sense, as Alex was saying, then bioprospecting and benefit sharing was specifically marked as how these genetic resources, plants and animals included, have to be paid off as these commercial purposes in a fair and equitable way. This is one of the main conclusions for many of these panels. Then the private sector had a really huge engagement, exploring ways to incentivize businesses, but how to invest in biodiversity. I think the private sector wants to jump in, but they don't have the metrics or the appropriate mechanisms to jump in. Maybe it's work in progress, but there's still a lot of work. So that is clear. And then obviously mentioned by Charlotta and Pernille, the Indigenous and Lund communities in these aspects of how to run into these finance bioeconomy aspects. Well, the difficulties are mainly what was pinpointed in many of these conversations, at least in the green zones, was how this traditional ecological knowledge would be appropriated for financial mechanisms. So there is a disconnect, and how to do that? Well, we can discuss about it. Then the very forgotten kiddo on the block from these conversations was the monitoring and reporting. So a lot of attention was really, really distracted. So we need robust mechanisms to do that. But unfortunately, that was not committed. So all in resume, to finish up, in both the green and blue zones, this Cali Fund, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, and the Biodiversity Finance Dashboard was launched. Some nature bond toolkits that as guidelines. And then finally, this was part of like the biodiversity friendly financial solutions. And here we have a bunch of new kits on the block. Rather, 30 years ago, we had some of them, but they came back. So carbon credits for biodiversity benefits, biodiversity credits, biodiversity offsets, corporate loans with biodiversity KPIs, and debt for nature swaps. These are new kits and new terms appearing. So this is a lot of a new sort of like intake. And yeah, just to finish up, the green zone was very important to Colombian participants, Colombian citizens, because it was a very well engagement of this dynamism that is inside the country per se itself. So biodiversity was in every talk, and it was in very aspect, a very alive discussion. Not necessarily because it had to influence the blue zone, but it was a cultural cohesion that built it up in feeling how important this issue is. And I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I think it's, again, really important to get some alternative perspectives on some of these developments in Cali. And we're also really grateful that, you spent time in both the negotiation zone, the kind of officious kind of negotiation zone outside of town that's like heavily securitized and so on. And then you were also downtown at this green zone which was much more accessible to everyday people. And this was supposed to be the COP of the people, right? That's something that the Colombian government put a lot of emphasis on. And I would like to ask you, how do you see the legacy of this COP in Colombia, and also with some of these emphases like COP of the people, making peace with nature? Is this something that future COPs could kind of recognize and take account of?
I think definitely this is the very first time a COP has accomplished so many people, gathered so many people together. So there was an estimation from the Cali government that 150,000 people will attend the Green Zone. And that ended up basically crossing all expectations with 530,000 people coming from all across the country. So this was definitely a really inspiring issue to allow and to open up public spaces and different conversations, different organizations, institutions, researchers, activists, to put them together and be discussing about these different terms. And there was some quotes that across the Green Zone you will listen something such as, "Oh, in the blue zone, they're making decisions, but here we are resisting," or things like that. So it was very much the social vividity of the aspects of how is it to be, a biodiverse country with social conflicts, with its own Amazon, which I did my research work as a PhD on how environmental critical it is in hotspots of biodiversity, with tons of agricultural expansion drivers moving into very rich biocultural spaces. So I think Cali has set, and this COP specifically has set a huge ambition in how to connect these two different worldviews from the local people, from the real people, together with these politicians or etc. So I think this is super inspiring, and this is historical. And obviously coming from Colombia, I could see these two sides of people, being very inspired about it, and some others like, this is have done before. So I think in that sense, it gives room for any more creativity processes, but still financial structures, economical systems, they're still very broken in terms of how imaginative we can be towards these changes. So yes, I think I leave it there.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I agree, there's so much that we can take away that was inspirational about this COP of the people, because at times it felt like a huge biodiversity festival. And that's something that I think we could learn from elsewhere as well. So now I'm going to turn to Ashana Puri. Nice to see you again, Puri. We work together in the human rights-based multi-actor dialogue process. And so, Puri, if you wouldn't mind shedding some light on some of those broader themes at the COP, and then also discussing what you think might be the significance for implementation as well and action on the ground. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry, just am I audible? Am I clear enough?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect, great. Yeah, so I have to use Pernilla's microphone to ensure that there will be no feedback. But thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the previous panelists for the great insights, and also the organizer. And thank you for the opportunity to share here. So I think from my side, I would really like to share about the dialogue process on inclusive conversations, exploring the role of a human rights-based approach to biodiversity and climate actions. This is an initiative which is done jointly with the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network Consortium, which is a partnership between UNDP, UNEP, WCMC, UNESCO, and then together also with SudBio, Sogagaka International, Climate Development and Knowledge Network, and of course Focali. So really happy to see you here again, Stephen. So I think many of us know that with the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework during COP15, that it's not just the target, not the goals and targets, but there are also different sections that are included in it. And then one of them is the section C, which is kind of, basically kind of like a principles or guidance on how the framework itself, including its vision, mission, goals, targets, is to be understood, acted upon, implemented, reported, evaluated, and that it needs to be consistent to those elements in the section C. And one of them is actually a human rights-based approach. But also there's intergenerational equity, there's the human rights to healthy environment, there's the gender equality. But after the adoption of that, and also working in the intersection of biodiversity and climate, not to mention that the Paris Agreement itself also in the preambular paragraph mentioned the importance of respecting human rights. And there are a lot of questions around, but what does that mean actually to apply a human rights-based approach in biodiversity and climate actions, and especially in the synergies of these two areas, and what could be the role, and then like what could be the concrete steps to move forward. And this is how the dialogue process itself it was kind of like became the birth of the dialogue process itself. So over the course of this year, we have been having different sessions, be it online or also in-person sessions, engaging with representatives of various actors, Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth. I see Peter here, you're also participating in this, some member states, research communities, and international NGOs. And then all of these sessions, they culminated into a multi-actor dialogue that took place just right before the COP in Cali. And so we basically trying to understand, but what does that mean exactly to apply it? We look at different examples of how different actors have applied it in their respective works, but also in their lives itself. There's something that came up very interestingly during the workshops, but also the dialogue, how a human rights-based approach should be a lifestyle, for example. That is how we should, but there are many different perspectives. The dialogue itself serves to be, before coming into the negotiations, to understand the different perspectives of different actors, to listen with empathy, like really opening up ourselves. And it was such a beautiful and humbling experience. And then actually maybe I'm just going to wrap it up here, but also linking to what Clarice mentioned beforehand when she shared about what happened in the climate and biodiversity negotiation in that particular agenda item, and then what the decision actually came. There's a third paragraph under that decision that says, urges parties when undertaking actions towards the achievement of Target 8 and 11, as well as related targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, in line with national circumstances, priorities, and capabilities with their respective obligations under relevant multilateral environmental agreements to implement effective social and environmental safeguards, but also to be consistent with the Section C and Target 22, which is really on the full, effective, inclusive participation of the KMGBF. It doesn't, and it looks into the synergies, but also another thing that we appreciate so much from this dialogue process is that it really takes into account the diversity of values, worldviews, and knowledge systems, including the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, which is also included in the paragraph 3E of the decisions. So we really hope to move forward. There are a couple of outcomes that maybe I could share also later, if there's some time, to really move forward into the implementations and also continuing this process moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Puri. And it's really great to hear about not only the efforts that you've been making personally and with your teams to forward this issue of the Section C, the social dimensions, these cross-cutting dimensions across the targets, but also get a sense from you about where you see progress being made in relation to the negotiation outcomes as well. My sense was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that perhaps some of these social issues were a little bit neglected at this COP. Do you think that's a fair representation?
Unfortunately, I had to leave COP actually for fairly early, and I couldn't really follow the contact group. But from the two contact groups that I have followed, especially in this biodiversity and climate, I think indeed there are a lot of discussions around. There are a lot of discussions more around like kind of like the science, like what Clarice already said, or the kind of like the pushback on it, and also there were really a lot of discussions around the resources or the financial aspects also in the biodiversity and climate itself, although now I think it looks pretty clean compared to what it looks like in the process. And I think I just would like to be careful, but in any case, I think from my side personally, but I think it's also shared with some others, that we are very happy that in any case, the paragraph 3 also still reflect that social dimensions, and then hopefully we can still move forward based on what has been agreed anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your take on that. Right. So now, last and certainly not least, we are going to move to Peter. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. If you wouldn't mind shedding some light on these themes that you picked up in Cali, and also how you think that they are significant for your work on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen, and also congratulations for putting up such an insightful session, especially trying to analyze outcomes of the really busy COP16. My name is Bulimo Peter, as you rightfully mentioned, and I co-lead the Inuka project, where we work with grassroots and youth groups working to develop, test, implement, and communicate their restoration project. And we just provide the capacity and the resources to enable them to do the work that they're passionate about, but also amplify it on the global stage. So myself being at COP was more a combination of a representation of that underrepresented group, but also trying to share experiences and perspectives on what we're doing, and also what we can leverage from other groups and stakeholders that were present at COP. I think more broadly, my focus was on understanding how we will finance the biodiversity plan, monitoring implementation progress, but also matters relating to access and benefit sharing in relation to Article 8J. I was there, of course, as a delegate of Youth for Nature, but also equally important as a participant for the HRBA process, which Shanturi has delivered to explain. So I might not go into detail, but of course, trying to just emphasize the need of the human rights-based approach and the significance that it has on bringing to light the role of indigenous communities, local leadership, but also amplify the youth and other underrepresented groups and ensuring that they holistically and meaningfully contribute to processes of biodiversity and climate action, but also looking at the significance of human rights-based approach in sort of trying to synergize and complement biodiversity and climate action and the nexus in between. I was also keen around matters to do with Indigenous peoples and local communities, because obviously that is the group that I'm working with, and I was happy with the decisions for both the subsidiary body and the creation of the work program. But besides that, I also attended another dialogue process that was a bit different from the HRBA process, which was the Montpellier process. And that more focused on trying to broker knowledge and the different knowledge systems that exist and the different viewpoints that people, especially in such spaces, hold. And some of the key takeaways that I was getting from that particular dialogue process as well was that we must embrace tensions, pain points, and obstacles, and that we need to engage and influence both horizontally and vertically. So just as we're trying to influence decision-making within COP, the same effort and energy that we need to try and influence our own local governments and also our own local actions, doing away with what is seemingly destructive to the environment and also appreciating what is meaningful or useful to the environment and moving it forward. And finally, what was a bit more amazing or interesting to me was that transformation will not happen through a linear process. The scaling of local initiatives is not enough. We need to move beyond think globally and act locally, and we need to ensure an iterative process that thinks and acts across all levels. So I think that was by and large the scale of what I was trying to look at. But on a side note, and rather down note, I think the decision on finance, I know because we didn't have quorum, we were not able to achieve that decision, and also the decision on implementation framework, which was key, and they were like the main things that were supposed to come out of this. The fact that we were not able to achieve that, I think it really sort of lowered the morale and the ambition, especially in terms of trying to align local action with what is happening at the multilateral scale.
Thank you so much, Peter. We get such a rich picture from those discussions, and there's so much more that we could dig into if we had more time. I am also grateful for you for connecting the global to the local and the national, not forgetting that that's really where the action happens, right? So there's so much work to be done there, and thank you for starting to connect those dots. Yeah, Maria just posted in the group, in the chat about Youth for Nature, the organization that Peter works for. They do amazing work across the different COPs. So also in the climate COP, they have a really big impact. So do check that out. So we are running a little bit out of time, I'm afraid. So now we're going to move to the last part of the session, and that is where I'm going to invite all of the remaining panelists. I think Alex had to go, but to invite everyone back to give some final reflections. So I would also, if you could spotlight Clarice and Charlotta and Jennifer, if she's still here, and Pernilla.
Jennifer lost her connection.
Okay, understood. Is it? Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, so you've all had the chance to listen to each other now, and we've, as I said a second ago, we've had such a rich picture of the negotiations, the conversations, the themes emerging. So I'd like to give you all the chance to for a short reflection based on what you've been hearing from your fellow panelists, and anything that you think is particularly relevant for our audience to take away as we look towards implementation, towards this national and local action, but also, of course, towards the other COPs and to future action at the level of the CBD. So I don't have a particular order that we should do this. Maybe I'll start with Peter, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Could you just repeat the question for clarity?
Yeah, of course. Would you like to give some reflections on what you've heard from your fellow panelists, or perhaps kind of emphasize a key takeaway that you think the audience should hear and take as we move towards implementation?
Yeah, sure. I think for the most of what I've gotten from the panelists that we made some progress, but again, we really fall off track in terms of the key things that we really hoped to get out of this to enable implementation or proper implementation of the targets. And for me, I think finance was a big one, especially noting the circumstances with which the COP ended. Most of the delegates, especially from the global South countries, having to leave before the discussion ends, and the need to call off to suspend the conversation because of quorum. And also looking at even the way the targets were presented, 114 countries were able to present their targets, but only 22% were able to submit their NBSAPs. And the way we keep making the process of financing a bit complex, I think it's by design exclusive to parties that are not well able financially, and this will derail progress towards realization of the biodiversity targets, and also because the previous targets, the Aichi targets, failed because of lack of our implementation framework, and we continue to see that iteration again being slowed down within this scope. I think that was also a point that I noted with concern.
Thank you, Peter. We really appreciate your perspective here. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I will turn, in the interest of time, perhaps Pernilla, if you don't mind, would you mind following? I'll mix up the two panels now so that it feels a bit more dynamic.
Yes, for sure. There are so many important perspectives being raised here, and one thing that I would like to highlight that is a bit of the longer perspective and the achievement of the permanent body on Article 8J on Indigenous peoples and local communities, the real impact from the traditional knowledge, practices and values and worldviews of Indigenous peoples and local communities, that with the stronger engagement in the value of this knowledge, practice and worldviews, and also more understanding of the need of exchange with all participants equally valid, is to say that you have reciprocity and usefulness for all in the exchange of knowledge and so on. This is also something that is very promising for the implementation of the global biodiversity framework, but also for the sustainability of the world. So this is something that is very much at the heart of the program of work, which we will be implementing now alongside the KMGBF.
Thank you so much. So again, straight on to the next panelist, if you don't mind. Perhaps your fellow SwedBio colleague, Puri, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. Actually, hearing what Pernilla said, I would like to take this opportunity to actually share some of the what the participants of the multi-actor dialogue actually mentioned during the discussion, and kind of like the key kind of takeaways or outcomes of the multi-actor dialogue. And it may not be in the full citations of what they said, because we've got quite a lot of participants there, but the first thing and foremost is that they call for recognitions that a human rights-based approach is not just morally and legally required, but it could be actually the most effective way to achieve biodiversity and climate goals. And then they call also for addressing the root causes of biodiversity loss and climate change, including extractivism and inequitable economic systems. And then, of course, with aligned with what Peter said is how we should ensure intergenerational equity in all actions and decisions. And then, as Pernilla already mentioned beforehand, around Indigenous peoples and local communities, that there's a need, or it's must that we have to prioritize the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including their collective rights alongside individual rights, and support Indigenous and traditional knowledge systems and practices. And last but not least is that they have been asking to foster more of this multi-actor collaborations and dialogue, building trust and reciprocity in all partnerships. So hopefully this would be the ground, also the foundations of all of ours moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Puri. And I think that also emphasizes how many relationships are kind of playing out at these COPs. You know, it's not just what makes it into these decision texts, is it? It's all of these interactions that are occurring as well. And that's something else to be kind of recognizing and taking account of. Jessica, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. And in that note, how to put it like briefly, and coming back to what Peter mentioned, on how much of the attention was put on finance as the hype of, you know, how in terms of the decisions and how to continue with that. Actually, this COP was a disaster. There was not any commitment. There was not any compromise seriously on how to understand the specific roles of biodiversity and the pillars of biological genetic forces into how our human systems are navigating towards. So there is some critics that I had to highlight it as taking opportunity of this panel. So the way markets are approaching the communities nowadays is very wrong, and this is work to be done. But obviously, this goes to the local and national levels of how to put that action into perspective as well. In many countries, sadly, the transparency on this different participation of these communities is invisible. So how to visualize it, how to highlight it, or even more include it in the national strategies for biodiversity, even in the global framework, will be a challenge for everyone and any government appearing. So as it calls for these financial instruments, many of them are not in dialogue directly with the communities. These financial instruments come from the parties or the governments or even the private sector directly, being insufficiently enough and solid, robustly necessary to prove like how is this co-creation of these financial mechanisms if we are talking about a co-creation. And I have to mention very out and loudly, nature is not a tradable thing neither. We have to remember that nature is specifically one of the key relationships as humans in this planet. So I want to mention that measurement of biodiversity cannot be blinded by the specificity of a mechanism or a number or attack. This is context dependent. It is fundamental. It is a component importance rather than just, you know, putting a dollar value thing in nature. This is a situation of non-existing agents for a market price. So this is, not enough accountability, and I will finish there.
Thank you, Jessica. I think it's really important to hear these alternative perspectives, and you're shedding light on some really concerning trends as well. So it's really important. We are running out of time, I'm afraid, so I do need to turn to our final two panelists. So, Clarice, would you mind? You mentioned that there were some issues you wanted to dig into earlier, but there is anything that you've heard from your panelists you want to respond to as well?
The pressure to say something in a very short amount of time. I think
apologies.
No, I'll skip the concrete outcomes and maybe just take a bit of a personal reflection on what we've heard about the sort of multi-dimensions and the vast cast of actors and characters we met in Cali. And I'm not the first to draw some parallel between this and the sort of coming of age of the climate process in Copenhagen, when thousands and thousands of more actors than were anticipated showed up. And I think this is the first COP within the biodiversity scene where we see something similar, where everyone is sort of realizing it's the moment of truth, that this impacts us all. It's hugely important. It's interconnected. We need to be creative. We should be terrified. We need to act. That comes with all parts, the angst that I struggle with personally, but also with that a sort of kick to action. And it means that we need to be constructively critical and creative. And I think having discussions like this is part of that. We can consider what roles we play, where are we best needed, where can we make the biggest impact. You see here from Little Sweden, we were 3, Pernilla, Charlotta, and I, who had chair roles in this COP. Within the EU, we have maybe some room to do that. So that was our decision in this case, but we all have roles to play, and we can wear different hats at different times. And I think that's important to consider. And then again, outside of my professional role, this is very much as looking to my past. I spent 10 years researching climate finance, and now we're seeing finance is also a really critical issue here. And again, this has nothing to do with the role I play in the negotiations, but it came up within the climate and biodiversity over and over again. I think Puri mentioned that there is a paragraph on financing. There's this hang up, and we on the financing side can't double count. We know we need more financing for everything. We can all agree on that, but we can't let that also be a hindrance to implementing synergistically. And this is a really difficult discussion to have, but it's one we have to have, and we have to help everyone get beyond this and be able to say, yeah, we don't have time to not implement synergistically and talk about it. And we don't have time not to have a lot more financing going to this, but we can't let this conflict impede action right now. And that's my personal project. So I'll leave with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That sounds relatively concrete to me, but I also appreciate what you said earlier, and I've found myself personally moved by what you were saying. So thank you so much. So now, last but not least, I want to give the final words to Charlotta. You opened for us, and now I would be grateful if you would close for us as well. Thanks, folks, for sticking around. We're a couple of minutes over. After Charlotta finishes, I'll just say a few words of thanks, and then we'll close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devin. I feel, well, it's very difficult to say with the final one, but many good things have already been said. And first of all, I would like to thank all panelists for their perspectives. It's very interesting to hear all different views. And I think that is also, when you look at the COP16, and that is the beauty of it all, that you have all these different voices, and we need to keep the conversation ongoing. I just would like, just on my personal side, as I mentioned, I was chairing one on the working groups one. It was a very complex meeting. I think it was difficult for everybody to keep track of all different negotiations at the same time. Many contact groups, technical small groups, and difficult to follow everything. But I still would like to once again highlight that we actually managed to have several decisions important, and I'm really happy about the DSI. The AJ decisions, decision on marine uses, and all that was mentioned. I'm not saying that we still need to continue, and I'm very happy about have different perspectives on this, because we need to come back and try to finalize that was out. That's not been finalized, because it's very important that we do it shortly in time to continue our implementation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So it's now time to say goodbye. And I really, really want to say an incredible, well, I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us, to the panelists, for all these rich insights. I think it's been an amazing form of unpacking what happened, and also debriefing on what the significance of these developments are. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been recorded, so I'm fairly sure that there'll be an even larger appetite for kind of digesting this conversation at later dates. And I also want to thank the team behind the scenes. So Maria Erland at Focali, Maria Held at SIANI and SEI, Jessica and Sarah and Therese at Lund University, and also to everyone that joined us in the audience and for your really interesting and important questions that you raised. So thanks everyone for your interest, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, everyone, and have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much, everyone.